Hi, Andrew. It's great to meet you. Could you please start by introducing yourself and telling us a story of how Vocabulary Ninja came to be?
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for having me, first of all.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, yeah, Vocabulary Ninja is something that started quite a while ago, really, when probably about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. And it was when I was working at a school in Stockton, up in Teesside. And I was year six teacher at the time, and I just started getting into sort of meeting people on Twitter, getting into sort of the edgy Twitter side of things. And at the time, vocabulary wasn't really anything that I was particularly interested in. But at the end of year six, we didn't have a particularly strong set of reading results. And at the end of that, it made me sort of think, well, apart from the obvious, threads around reading comprehension and all of those sort of obvious things, one of the things that really struck me for the children in particular were quite an impoverished area of Stockton. Vocabulary was something that I'd never really considered, but having done a little bit of reading and really looking at where children lost marks on the papers and things like that, vocabulary is something that started to come through my mind that was like, right, there's something here that we need to try and prioritize a little bit. And basically, at the end of that, I wrote a few little articles, blog posts. And within that, I just coined a little, when I look back at it, I coined a little phrase about being a vocabulary ninja. And that year sort of ran past, and the results at the end of the year, because we really focused on reading, were hugely improved. And I wrote that blog article just as a bit of a reflection. And like I say, within it, I coined the phrase vocabulary ninja.
Yeah.
And as a result of, because the idea behind it is that it's more about being, aside from the business, it's about that mentality in the classrooms, have that awareness of language and vocabulary and the impact it can have.
Yeah.
So you've got to be switched onto it all the time. And that's what it's all about, really. And that's basically where it stemmed from. And because I was creating lots of resources and just sharing them, it just sort of grew from there and built a lot of traction and people who were really engaged by it, really. So it was a bit of luck, really. There wasn't any sort of grand scheme behind it. It was just sort of just reflecting on what had worked well for the pupils, and what we sort of as a year six team prioritized to try and improve things the next year, which was good, I suppose.
Yeah, no, sometimes that's the way these things happen, though. It's just kind of one thing leads to another, doesn't it? So obviously it was that. So what inspired the name Vocabulary Ninja? You just said it was like a phrase you coined, but what was like the meaning behind that? Just because I'm curious about it.
Yeah, like I say, it was very much that I just sort of said in terms of, I think the blog article's still there, like a little WordPress site somewhere. But it was very much about sort of, I was just trying to get across when I wrote it that it was very much about sort of having that ninja-like presence when it came to vocabulary. I don't know why I said that. I just did. And it was very much about just having that mentality to just be aware of it. I think in the article I wrote about how you need to sort of be prepared to jump and pounce on every opportunity that vocabulary presents within the classroom. And then as a result, it was like, well, it's a little bit ninja-like. So it literally just flowed out of that. And actually, it's quite nice. And then as a result, I sort of got a little character designed and stuff like that. It all just seemed to again, there was no real big plan or intent to even think about running a business to start with. It just sort of flowed from like I say, just being a little bit reflective when it came to teaching. And sharing resources for other teachers, and like I say, it just grew from there. It was quite nice.
Yeah, that's really a bit happened in a very organic way then. And the name definitely makes it memorable.
It does, and it's quite, aside from, it is quite child friendly, which is quite nice.
Of course.
The way it's grown, like I say, it engages the pupils, first and foremost, which is what you want. But obviously, there's a lot of sort of sound sort of teaching and learning theory that sits behind it now, which is which I've built over time, because like I said, that again, that wasn't there to begin with.
Yeah, it's just sort of mounted. So you talked about how Vocabulary Ninja started, but what is the vision for it?
I guess again, like I said with the first point, part of it is obviously there's a little bit more of a strategic vision behind it now, but it's just continuing the same sort of vein. I think having the opportunities that I've had to work with Bloomsbury and publish the books, I think, I think at the moment I'm looking over there because there's a few sort of the front covers on the wall. But I think we've now published over 30 books in the past 3 years.
That's a lot of books.
Yeah, I think Vocabulary Ninja was published in 2018. And since then, obviously, we've published another sort of 20. I think 30 plus. It's ridiculous. I haven't even got count of them. But I know, there's another Timetable Ninjas just being published this month with Sarah Farrell, which I know is going down a storm in school. Write Like a Ninja was a bit of a whirlwind success and continues to be. It's been absolutely massive. So I think that the sort of little mantra that I sit under is sort of teaching simplified, learning amplified, and everything that I try to do is very much, it has that at the heart of it. So I think the vision is very much about just what I can do to, as a teacher myself, I still work in the school that I was assistant head at 1 day a week now. But
brilliant.
It's still very much about whatever I can do. Everything sits at the heart of that. It has to have some form of impact or significant impact for pupils in terms of their learning. But then the other side of that is, can we just make things a little bit more simple for everything? Obviously can be quite complex, can't it? So I think at a point is, where can we be? I've always found personally that if we can keep things simple and be really, really consistent with it, no matter what it's in regards to, that's where we get the impact with learning. Or I've found that anyway. So it's very much about that, trying to create systems and resources and anything that can support teachers to keep things as simple as possible so that they can be consistent, because primary schools especially can be crazy places to work in terms of just, the unexpected things that pop. So trying to be consistent is really, really, I liken it sometimes in my training to sort of going to the gym or having, being on a little bit of a diet, but the consistency is absolutely central to any form of success. So that's a little bit of where I'm trying to go, because it's just me.
Yeah, I can't believe it's just you. I was really surprised when I read that.
Yeah,
you must be so busy all the time.
Yeah, it's never ending, but it's good, and it's probably at a stage now where it maybe needs to sort of grow a little bit. And I'd love to think that it was something that could have other education-based people involved with it. But with being in school, even this year I've been working in school 3 days a week. So it's it's just it's manageable and it's working so far. So it's fab. So we'll keep going and see what happens.
No, absolutely. No, that's fantastic. So you mentioned obviously it's really important to you that the work that you do has an impact. What have been some of those wow moments for you from that?
Yeah, it's quite hard, like you said, because it's so busy sometimes.
You forget, I guess.
Those sort of moments sort of just pass you by a little bit. And I remember I do make an effort now where, when there are those moments like Timetable Ninjas published, because everything's on so much of a treadmill. I remember when Vocabulary Ninja was published, I remember it being a bit of an anticlimax, which sounds a little bit weird because, you're published, it's amazing. I never thought anything like that would ever happen. And you think, wow, I've hit that peak. And when it happened, it just doesn't feel like that. It feels like, well, what's next a little bit? It's being greeted as a success, which is fab. But it's then the next thing. And then all of a sudden, next day you're working on whatever's next. But no, there has been some fab things. I think people's always a big thing in terms of a wow moment. I know when I wrote Write Like a Ninja, it was fab to get Alan Pete on board. I know when I first, I remember emailing his wife, and his wife was lovely before I sort of had any conversations with Alan. I remember when I first started teaching, Alan, some of I think his exciting sentences was some of the first sort of apps that I downloaded on my phone or my iPad so that I could use with my pupils.
Yeah.
So to have him sort of eagerly come on board with something that I was doing was amazing. So I was really buzzing about that. I thought that was really good. Yeah. And I think just then the general success of Write Like a Ninja has been a bit of a wow moment, because it's sold a huge amount of copies, and I know schools have bought them individually in their hundreds for pupils. Wow. So I know for that book in particular, I know it continues to have a massive impact on pupils in school. But there was one. I've got one. I went and searched. Obviously, I got your questions, but I went and found an email, and there's loads of things that stand out. But I've just got it on my phone. I won't read the parent's name out. But I got this email. When was it? It was February last year, and it was just out of the blue from a parent. And I'll just read some bits quickly to you because it's really
of course.
She put, "Hi Andrew, my son has recently started doing your Comprehension Ninja Year 6 book at home. And I can't remember where it first came from. Maybe it was social media. Anyway, sorry, I'll have to zoom in. Anyway, I'll just have to tell you how transformative it has been for us. My son has always struggled with comprehension and could never see the answers fully and understand the questions. He rarely engaged with any of the exercises we try to get him to do at home. And we've always had a battle on our hands. We weren't hopeful that this book would be any different, and we were worried that the text would be too long for him. But how wrong we've been. And actually, the texts have had him totally enthralled. He actually asked us if he could do more last night. The topics really interested him, and his favourite so far has been about Barack Obama. Much to our surprise, we didn't even think he knew who he was. All of the exercises are so well compiled, and for the first time, we can actually see what precisely it is that he finds difficult, and we're able to work on that in isolation. He's even started using a dictionary voluntarily, and even when he reads his chapter books in the evenings. But most importantly, which is the most important thing, he finally seems to have some confidence in himself, and it's absolutely astounding the impact that has increased over the last few weeks. He's reading more without being asked, his spelling has improved, and he's using more adjectives and adverbs in his writing. We'd become a bit snowblind about how best to help him, so we're so very grateful that we found your products. I've recommended to school as well. Since the pandemic, homeschooling has been difficult enough. All the best from the mum. So out of all the sort of wow moments, I think just knowing that the books have had that sort of impact on one child is enough,
I mean, that's huge. Obviously, if it's something that he's struggled with for some time, to be able to gain that confidence and to be able to enjoy reading as well.
That's it, isn't it? It's huge. So even just even just having that one little email about regardless of all the books and etc. and so on, if we can have that sort of impact on a child, then
exactly.
and the parents, because the parents
it means so much, doesn't it? No, that's brilliant, and it's lovely as well that obviously it's been a useful resource for homeschooling during the pandemic as well.
Yeah, well, we did try to turn that around quite quickly in terms of, obviously we had the main Comprehension Ninja books are primarily aimed at schools and teachers. So obviously no one knew the pandemic was coming. So we quite quickly tried, Bloomsbury did quite quickly try to turn around those products to get them to market, to support parents at home, because obviously it was a difficult time for everybody.
Of course. So you're very passionate about developing lots of different kinds of resources, but obviously vocabulary is where it all started. And you mentioned that your class, you noticed there were a lot of difficulties with that. That's where some of those areas were lying, where they were struggling with tests and things like that. What are some of the common difficulties that pupils have developing vocabulary, and how can teachers address this?
Yeah, I think it's everything's linked, isn't it? I think obviously you can look at vocabulary on its own and just think, right, well, we'll focus on teaching new words, for example, and so on. I think a lot of vocabulary, or children's lack of vocabulary, I think there's two aspects to it. There's the social side of it in terms of the language and communication that children are exposed to at a young age. So, right from when they're being born, they're picking up those language and communication skills and vocabulary that sits within inside that from every single adult and in an interaction that they're involved with. So I think first, and obviously then you start to think about social poverty, etc., and so on, and that has a huge impact on the type of vocabulary that children and the amount of vocabulary that children will come into school with. And then secondly, the other side of the coin there is obviously reading, because naturally the types of vocabulary that you'll find in the book you won't always use in your own sort of spoken vocabulary. So it's about trying to blend that together a little bit. So I think what I try to do is trying to find that manageable balance of, well, how do we address that? So I think teaching words in isolation, again, isn't really going to work, because they're not going to be retained, if I'm honest. And then not And then just focusing on reading isn't going to work either, because obviously you need to have that time to sort of dig into vocabulary. So Vocabulary Ninja, in essence, is all about trying to blend those two things in terms of, again, trying to find a daily routine of 10 or 15 minutes where we teach some new vocabulary of specific tier 2 vocabulary, which is what I try to focus on when it comes to teaching new vocabulary. Because when you think about the primary school day, if you think as a teacher, there's no time to spend an hour or half an hour, or that's just unmanageable.
No, yeah, of course.
So 10 minutes a day at the beginning of an English lesson, focusing on a new piece of tier 2 vocabulary is probably one of the main things that I preach. And that's what my Vocabulary Ninja system is all about, because ideally we're going to be picking vocabulary. So ideally, if you're using, let's say, Room 13 by Robert Swindells as your class text, then ideally as a teacher, you would be reading ahead and you'd be picking out some of the key vocabulary that was tier 2. You'd be pre-teaching that in a cycle moving forwards, maybe a week or two before you hit that chapter. So so you then have those opportunities to use that vocabulary in an oral sense. You're going to display it, you're going to bring it into modeled writing. So then when you hit that chapter and that word that's maybe translucent or ascended, or I'm trying to think of what some of the characters are doing. I'm thinking about Ellie Mae going up the stairs. So she ascended the stairs. As a result, the children have had 2 weeks of opportunities of hearing that sort of orally modeled in writing, unpicked. They've had it explicitly taught to them. So when they hit that, it's just moving through it, and that complete understanding is there now. You never go. The word gap is huge, so you're never going to bridge it. But it's about what you go. I always try to bring it back to going. You've got 190 school days. So if you teach them one word a day, which is all you're really going to be able to do in an explicit fashion, those 190 words that you teach are absolutely crucial, that you teach the most valuable words for your pupils that are the most versatile, and that they can make those links, which is going to enable them to retain that knowledge. So it's hard. I think it's just about knowing that when it comes to vocabulary, you're never going to fill that gap. It's impossible. What you've got to do as a teacher is just try and actively know that we've got a system in place to teach new vocabulary, but that has those links to the books that they're reading. And then as a result, children are going to use that vocabulary as authors in their writing. So that's what it's all about for me, because, it is difficult. And having that focus on tier 2 vocabulary in an explicit sense, having a focus on tier 1 vocabulary in conversation, and making sure that we're utilising as much tier 1 vocabulary as possible, especially in the lower parts of school, and then specifically teaching tier 3 vocabulary when we get into sort of subject-specific lessons like science, plants, history, whatever it may be. So again, lots of teachers won't understand or won't know of the different tiers of vocabulary, which is understandable. So again, I suppose that's my little sort of journey at the moment, is just trying to spread the word and support teachers and schools to better understand how to support pupils.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, especially what you were saying about linking it to the books they're reading and things like that, because in isolation they're not really going to understand or retain that.
There's so many little nuances, and I think there's no research behind my theory, but I think schools now over the next few years will get a lot of pupils coming into school who because that early communication is so important, and the language that we experience from the adults around us, how to hold conversations, conversational turns, the types of vocabulary that's used. There was lots of children grew up in isolation for the first part of their lives, or that toddler period where they weren't at mums and dads groups, they weren't going round to nanas, they weren't going to little clubs. It was COVID. So there'll be lots, and especially the children who are in those lower social brackets. I do think schools will see an increase in children with, and this is just me speculating, by the way. I do think that makes sense that schools will encounter children who have more speech and language issues, reduced vocabularies, inhibited communication skills, which then ultimately impacts on children's ability to read and write. So phonics as well is going to be crucial for that, for schools to counteract that.
Yeah, that makes sense. They haven't had those same opportunities that they would usually have for socializing.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? And and even the simple things like being read to and so on. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because despite COVID, reading data at Key Stage 2 went up. The standardized scaled score went up. So
I guess you can always read a book in lockdown.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's when you look at it, and obviously when you think of what will have been the most straightforward, maybe people will disagree with this. Writing was clearly the most difficult thing to teach online, and it is. Reading, though, the one thing that parents will have been able to do without any sort of subject knowledge would have been, you need to read your book. You need to read your book. So that, whereas they maybe wouldn't have had that time. I find it difficult to read with my kids on a night because it's just so hectic. So having that time during the day to go, or 2 or 3 times a day, read your book for 20 minutes, read your book for 20 minutes, read your book for 20 minutes. And then some of the activities that schools will be sending home for comprehension, parents, I think, maybe would have felt the most comfortable looking at reading comprehension. So it'll be interesting, wouldn't it, to know why that was, because you would assume that everything would have dropped slightly, but reading didn't with it. So
that is interesting. It would be interesting to kind of unpick that a bit more.
Yeah.
So you speaking of like reading, you've written brilliant kind of comprehension series of non-fiction books for year 1 to year 6 pupils. What are your key strategies for developing comprehension skills?
So I'm a bit of a rambler, so I'll keep this one a bit short for you. The key thing for me, I'm always interested in teaching misconceptions. And when I say misconceptions,
that's good fun.
What I mean is misconceptions that teachers have. And I think this can be a problem. So my 2 examples are, so when you would teach, let's say, I don't know, I always say, imagine you're being observed and you say, somebody tell me what an adjective is. And you have that child throws their hands up and goes, oh, Mr. Jennings, an adjective is a describing word. And you go, great. And you have a little look at the observer and there's a nod. And I think, but again, that's one of those things that I can't, there's a phrase that I use to describe those sort of phrases. But those sort of things are things that teachers accept or say that an adjective is a describing word or a verb's a doing word. And we accept that because we don't necessarily have a strong understanding of how or what that actually is itself. So when we hear that and go, yes, it is, but it doesn't really help the children, because when it comes to them finding an adjective in a text or a SPAG test, they can't do it because all they know is an adjective is a describing word. It doesn't help. And that's true of reading as well, because so the key thing for reading comprehension for me is getting children to understand what key information in a text is. And it's another throwaway phrase that I used to use it. And you'd go, well, when you pre-read the text, underline or highlight the key information. And the kids will go, yeah, okay. And children will read through, but we've got to be so much more specific about what key information is. And children they'll say, oh, is it adjectives and this? And children will just basically underline anything. So you teachers have to be more specific. So the key things that I say, I'll give you these and it works really, really well, because I just go back to these all the time. So the first thing I get, and they need a little bit of a grammatical understanding of grammar, nouns and verbs. The first thing that I talk to children to do, and I train them to do this, is to identify nouns. So I always say nouns, names. So, and I'll get them rehearsing, going through text and identifying what are proper nouns in the text, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. Nouns are unbelievably important in terms of they will always crop up in the question. So then you can relate that to the text to skim and scan to find the answer. So when children pre-read a text, if we can train them to underline or highlight the nouns, straight away, if you just did that as a task and children did it accurately, you've sort of cut away half of the nonsense of the text, because the nouns are there and they can really see visually where they are. And obviously common nouns are the things they tend to miss. But obviously I would focus on modeling to children how to do that first and go through a text with them or small paragraphs and highlight the nouns and then show them how they can then spot the nouns in the question. So, for example, if the noun was Finland, I don't know why I thought Finland. If you then got a question about what is the population of Finland, then all you're looking for is Finland. Go back to where Finland is, read that sentence. The answer will be there. So it's all about helping children navigate a text more confidently rather than going, underline the key information. Well, what even does key information mean?
Yeah.
The first thing it means is nouns. And you'll find them in both non-fiction and fiction and poetry. The other thing, there's 5 things, but I'll just give you 2 because these are the 2 most important. The second one is just numbers and statistics. So any form of number, so date, it could be money, it could be time, it could be the name of a day, anything that links to numbers, it could be percentages, it could be fractions, it could be absolutely anything. I would train children to highlight those. And obviously those massively crop up in non-fiction. So those 2 things that's where I would, I'll be starting again with year 6s in September. When it comes to reading, that'll be the first thing as a matter of course that I go, right, we all need to understand what key information means. And key information means, to start with, nouns and numbers. And once they nail that, you'll find a massive upturn in how confidently children navigate a text from a question back to the information and then finding the answer. And it works really, really well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Like you say, those are obviously very common across all texts, and things like the nouns and obviously anything to do with dates and things like that. That does give you like an overview of the text in general, doesn't it? They're like the key bits that you need to understand it before you delve any further.
100%, because for a lot of children, as soon as you start saying and underline the verbs and underline or highlight those, lots of children find that very, very difficult to do. Adults would find that difficult to do. So nouns, I guarantee you, if you went away and did this as a task this afternoon, and you just highlighted the nouns and the verb and the any numbers and statistics that cropped up in a text, I would pretty much guarantee that 90% of any questions that children got would contain nouns or numbers. And then if you just related that one piece of vocabulary back to the text, because then they would increase their success rate and confidence. And that's what it's about. We teach children strategies in maths to increase their confidence so that they can just go 1, 2, 3, done. And they don't really have reading. We don't really have that as much for comprehension.
That's true.
Whereas this works really, really well in terms of we can read through and highlight as we go, noun, number. And obviously we're reading as we go, the text. But the more I've done this with pupils over the last 3 years, where I've specifically taught this, those children, do really, really well in obviously for SAT. So that's what I'm generally working for. They generally, their confidence tackling a paper and answering questions is improved hugely. So yeah, I would definitely recommend trying to do that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Speaking of the comprehension side of things, are there any particular texts that you'd recommend teachers use? I mean, I know there's loads, but are there any that kind of stand out for you that you think are quite useful for this?
Text in terms of books?
Yeah. Or, well, it doesn't even just have to be books, I guess. I mean, reading's reading.
I think the biggest thing, obviously, it's the year 6 teacher in me. I've always got sort of statutory testing in the back of my mind. I think the biggest thing, as opposed, I wouldn't necessarily sit here and recommend any particular text. But I think there's loads of books that I love working with over the, I've already mentioned Room 13. Michael Morpurgo gets a bit of a hard time sometimes, but I always liked using Friend or Foe. I always liked, the children always really liked the ending, etc. and so on. Same with Room 13 by Robert Swindells. But then more recently, what is The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane? Absolutely, what a book. More for like a year 3, 4 audience. But there's so many fabulous books that are published all the time nowadays. But I've used those. But I think the biggest thing for teachers and for parents, and I think again this is something that children come unstuck with, especially when it comes to testing, is just seeing different variations of different types of text. So even though it is fiction, I know like the SATS paper this year, the first text that signed it, the first page was basically a football pitch with different positions and a couple of statistics at the bottom. And loads of kids just struggle to just see that information because they opened it. Obviously, it was dead straightforward, but the majority of the text was on the next page. But there was a few questions that linked to that although it was fiction, it was more of a non-fiction sort of display of the information, wasn't it? And I think often kids are thrown by just seeing information presented in a different way. So I would definitely just recommend, because obviously fiction's very much, well, you know what I mean, isn't it? It's just page by page of. So I think where possible, finding opportunities to look at fiction in a non-formal way, where possible, to look at things in different ways, and just making sure that children have a good opportunity to see as many different ways that information can be presented. Because you know, like nowadays, children spend a lot of time on their phones. They don't, you know, on newspapers and etc. and all that sort of stuff. I think within fiction, just trying to have the opportunity to see fiction in as many different. I was trying to think of how because I don't, you know, recommending books. There's so many great ones.
No, yeah, of course, but it's the variety, isn't it? I was thinking as well, it's probably useful looking at things like, for example, newspapers, because I remember showing them to my class once before, and they were just confused by the concept of reading in columns. Yeah. So obviously that was quite a big kind of thing as well.
Absolutely, and I think stats papers especially. Trying to think back through some of the examples, just how they're laid out in that booklet format. It's just irregular, isn't it? Versus you know, if we're reading from a text in a standard format, it's page by page. And you know, even obviously the non-fiction one, you know, if we read non-fiction in school, quite often again it's quite linear, isn't it, in terms of page by page, or there's maybe, whereas the SATs papers, again, with the testing in my mind, it's like jumbled round in boxes, and we don't tend to present children information that way too much in school, or so I just think finding opportunities to put information in front of them in as many different ways as possible, because even just things like headings and titles, they don't see them, do they? So, again, that comes back to just not being exposed to that prior. It's new, isn't it? That's why they struggle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So obviously all of your resources really support all those different, developing those different skills and building confidence and support. But how can your resources be used to support a school's curriculum?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, reading again, opportunities to embed reading is really, really important. Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is, I suppose, you know, without being sort of salesy, which I never really like, the Comprehension Ninja non-fiction books were created with the school's curriculum in mind, or at least the standard curriculum with the national curriculum. So there's 24 texts in every book, and what I did when I wrote it, I tried to map the texts against the national curriculum. So, for example, when that mum sent me that email, obviously Barack Obama, as part of many schools of curriculum, will crop up possibly in year 6, world leaders, etc., and so on, and leaders from different cultures. But so, for example, you know, I'll probably pitch this one wrong. Well, I know Crime and Punishment, for example. So in the year 6 non-fiction book, there is a really strong text on crime and punishment. Likewise, in year 2, there's one about, I think, toys through the ages, which is the typical one. Florence Nightingale's a really typical year 2 topic. There's a text about Florence Nightingale and all the associated different questions, literally hundreds of questions on Florence Nightingale. So the Comprehension Ninja non-fiction books, which, like I say, I've got 24 texts,
it's a lot of different texts.
Books, it's obviously, I never really get the opportunity to talk about them like this, but I've mapped them to support reading across the curriculum, and children also having the opportunities to read again a text presented in a slightly maybe different way, where they can learn about, you know, what will probably be, you know, Vikings is in there, or, you know, I could list them all. You'd know what I would list. As you go through school, all those different curriculum topics are basically included in those books. So they're a really strong way of supporting children's retention of subject knowledge, which is really high on. You know, I'm a governor at my children's school, and we had an Ofsted inspection 2 weeks ago, and obviously children's retention of what they're being taught was high in the agenda in all conversations with the inspector. So anything that schools can do that, schools can do to support that is going to be important. Just reading across the curriculum in general. So obviously the Write Like a Ninja books are there. Ideally, in my head, they can be used to support writing across the curriculum, not just in English lessons. And lots of schools do that, because the idea of the book well, I've got one here, but it's parceled up for the little competition. The idea is that, you know, if people were writing or children were writing, the size of it, etc., is the idea is that could really just be there on the desk while they're writing, so they can access all the grammatical features, but there's a lot of curriculum-based descriptive language in there and so on to support children's writing across the curriculum. So and again, without being salesy, the website that obviously has thousands of curriculum-based resources in terms of vocabulary display, content, knowledge organizers, and so on. But I think the biggest thing, like I say, is trying to embed that reading across the curriculum.
Not just in
the comprehension ninja books for non-fiction especially are absolutely huge for that, because it's like a little hidden thing in there that you wouldn't expect, but all of the texts are basically mapped against the curriculum as much as possible. So it's a win-win for schools, really, in terms of, you know, embedding those reading opportunities.
Absolutely, and those kind of cross-curricular learning opportunities always kind of work the best, because, like you say, it helps the retention so much.
Yeah, and it's versatile as well, because, you know, I appreciate schools are hugely busy. You know, so they could be used for interventions, they could be used for homework, there's loads of different ways that those books could be used. But as with anything, I try to make everything very much whole school, so schools can, so whether it's the books or resources on the website, the idea is that schools can use the resources and embed a system that, you know, they can talk to external bodies about, that they can talk to parents about, the teacher, that senior leaders can use to embed systems that run clearly through, you know, reception, year 1, year 2, all the way through. So they've got that consistency of approach throughout school. So, you know, as I said to you at the start, that's really, really important if we're gonna get impact for pupils.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on top of like all these like high quality resources, including like all the ones we just mentioned that are linked to the curriculum, you actually offer training to schools as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, again, it's very much about what I've talked to yourself about this morning. So vocabulary is the main one that I deliver, and I'll be delivering, you know, either going to school or I can do it virtually. But the main one is vocabulary, and going into school, 2 parts really to it, which is really trying to instill within teachers that why vocabulary is so important, so that the why element, and then how, so physically how they're going to set up their class. The idea is that from a morning's training or a twilight, schools should really go away equipped, being able for every teacher to make a few tweaks to their classroom with regards to a specific display, which I'm quite passionate about, running through the 10-15 minute teaching cycle of how and what vocabulary they're going to teach, which is essential in terms of subject knowledge, and basically just running through that so that they can embed this system in school throughout the whole school, so that with a 15-minute teaching moment every day, vocabulary can be at the heart of everything that's happening in the classroom, that's coming through in reading and writing. And it's not, like I said to you, it's not just about teaching vocabulary in its own little bubble. It's about the impact that it has specifically on children's writing, but their ability to retain that information as well. So it's quite heavily based in some sound sort of educational research as well, which I briefly touch on, because I always know that teachers want to go, well, where's the stuff that I'm doing tomorrow that I can
how do you know it's gonna exactly.
So 100%. And then likewise, the other main training that I deliver is around reading comprehension, which I've, you know, just skimmed over in the last question, but very much about how to support schools, improve standards in reading retrieval, which is that found. I always liken reading retrieval to like times tables. If you want to teach long division and all the different fraction elements and percentages well, children need really strong times tables, retrieval skills, don't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it's exactly the same with reading. If we want children to be strong summarizers and inferencers and all those other things, reading retrieval is basically the foundation of navigating the text and identifying where that information is, which, you know, I linked into about the key information. So it's like key information, retrieval, skimming and scanning, and then we can build into those other areas. So again, it's about, you know, that training that I deliver is very much about how do we really explicitly get beyond this key information and be really explicit with children around what is key information, how do we find it, how does that relate it into the questions, how do we then move from a question back to the text, and really sort of building a really strong whole school retrieval system that then lends itself to just taking everything forwards from there. So I always love working with schools where possible, and it's always really, again, it's that people thing. It's like today is really nice. I don't have the opportunity to do this that often, so having the opportunity.
Thanks. I enjoy it as well. It's lovely to actually get to talk to people.
And having that opportunity to collaborate is really, really great. And obviously, COVID. I think there's brilliant things like COVID's brought this forwards, which we can do. But it's still wonderful to get into schools and
that in-person connection,
talk to people and be in the school and get the vibe.
I went into a school last week that I haven't been in for ages, actually, where I used to teach, and it was so nice to like actually be in for the first time in so long. So I totally get that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like you say, I do that online, and it's just trying to fit it in where possible, really. So
of course.
I know before COVID, I was 4 days in school as an assistant head teacher at a school in Hartlepool, St Helens.
Wow.
And every Monday I used to go and do twilight. So I'd be driving down to Ipswich on like a Monday morning. I'd do a 2-hour twilight, and I'd drive back, get back at 11 o'clock at night, and then I'd be in school the next morning at 7:30. So
I'm sure online helps with that at least.
It does. It does, and it's been really interesting this year. Last year I had absolutely loads, which makes sense. Loads of schools last year wanted online training, and it's starting to switch back now, where schools are maybe a little bit tired of the online stuff. I think, like you said, there's perfect things where the online, everybody being able to be online works. Whereas I think there's still some things like certain parts of training where you want that personal touch.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to have that mix, isn't it?
100%.
Depending on the situation. Yeah, that's brilliant. And the last question really I had for you was, obviously you've got lots and lots of brilliant resources and support. Is there any other guidance for teachers that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's absolutely loads. I think the biggest thing that I I've sort of mentioned this again, and without sort of plugging too many other things, I think just trying to get into that. I always found for teaching, and I suppose for anybody who's teaching, but for NQTs, the biggest thing that I found that had an impact on my teaching career was subject knowledge. I think anything that you can do as a teacher. I remember in the first few years that I taught, I was never just, at school, B's and C's were my GCSEs. Obviously went to university, and I did sports science randomly. Nothing to do with like teaching. I never intended on being a teacher. I didn't train to be a teacher till I was 27. So, and obviously coming back into that education environment, especially with the grammar side of everything, but writing especially and reading, just that subject knowledge thing was just at the time I didn't really see it, because you're just in the moment, aren't you, when you're planning and you're teaching and you're marking and there's everything that you're getting used to. But before I knew it, it was sort of 3 or 4 years in when you're really still not 100% clear with certain things. And when you look back, it does have a really, really big impact on your teaching in terms of what you're able to do. So I know sort of about 3 years, was it about 3 years? Yeah, maybe about 3 years into sort of teaching, I really sort of made a bit of a promise. Around that time, I wrote that article, and I really started to get into how I could improve things. I just made a really big conscious effort to really get stuck into, not just that like talk about it, but really understand all the different grammatical terms and how they can be taught properly, and all the different aspects of reading and writing, to and maths as well, to really sort of just be a better teacher. Because I think to start with, you come into teaching a little bit, maybe not everyone, but thinking you know it all, and you really don't. There's always more to learn. Even now, there's so much to learn. So the biggest thing I would say would be that, and subject knowledge. So anything that you can get your hands on that's going to improve you, like Write Like a Ninja, the book, again, not plugging it. It's a great little book, just in terms of, it's dead cheap, but it just, if there's NQTs, or it's not NQTs anymore, is it? It's early ECTs.
Yeah, early careers teachers.
Anybody who's not 100% with, the grammatical side of writing, in terms of all of those sort of adjective, verb, conjunctions, and everything else, that little book is just packed with pages and pages and pages of it. So I would definitely recommend that. And the other thing, I watched the video. I'm terrible for getting distracted and watching like reels on Instagram and stuff like that.
So easily done, though.
There was one I was watching the other day, and there was a guy talked about passion and effort. So I'm gonna I'm going to quote this guy, not word for word, but he basically said, you get taught, or everyone says to follow your passion. And he said, follow your effort. And I watched the rest of it. And basically what he was saying was that the more you put effort in, and this is sort of what I did a little bit, the more you put your effort into things. He said, everyone has a passion, and it can be going to volunteer or going to do this, that, and the other. And he said, instead of doing, well, he said, obviously you can do that. He said, but what you should be doing is following your effort. So as teachers, where we put our effort in terms of developing our subject knowledge, he said, once you if you put effort into things and you practice and you try to learn, he said, you get better at things. And once you become better at things, you become closer to becoming an expert. And the closer the closer you are to becoming an expert, no matter how close that is, your confidence increases and your passion for that subject as a result increases. Yeah. So you're naturally
increasing your passions.
Your efforts will increase your passion for, or it will become your passion because you are an expert or you are someone who is, greatly versed in that. So I think that would be more than what sort of resources I would, again, with the subject knowledge vibe, I would be saying to teachers, put that effort, follow the effort sort of route, and drive that forwards. And that'll enable people to become much better teachers, or much better teachers without sounding, too harsh. And that as a result, that confidence and that passion will come for it more because they're so much more well versed in those subject areas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You talking about kind of actually learning things in depth reminded me of my teacher training being given just a paper list of grammatical terms and then a very simple sentence definition of what each one was, and being okay, right, this is what these are, but there's no real there's nothing to that. It was right, I need to actually delve into what this means and examples and how it would work, and it just reminded me of that really basic sheet.
Yeah, I remember my teacher training. I did a skit year, and it's ridiculous that I've wrote 30 plus books that have got a really strong grammar vibe to them. But I remember specifically on the first morning of attending, I'd obviously managed to get on the course, which was great. And I remember getting a spag. It was a grammar test, and it was basically literally what I've just been talking about. It was highlighting nouns and adjectives and things like that. So I remember one of the sentences was about a princess or something, and the princess did something, and it was highlight the noun. And I had absolutely no idea at all, not a clue. I remember messaging my wife at lunchtime. I remember messaging her. She probably shouldn't be admitting this, but I remember messaging her saying, "What's an hour? I said, I wasn't taught that at school." And I genuinely, today, I don't.
It's true, though, words were words. So I think it was the same for me. Nothing was really defined. It was just.
No, and I remember primary school fondly, but I don't even. I always say I don't really remember writing that often. I remember writing a diary that we wrote in every day. But what we do in school now, where writing is a really sort of full-on, intense, enjoyable process. We didn't do that when we were at school. So you would think children that get the education that they get nowadays versus absolutely no criticism of because where we are now.
It's just very different, isn't it?
It is very different, but it's when you think back to some of those moments and you think the journey and where you've ended up as a result. But again, that just links back to that process of effort. I say this to my children all the time. My daughter's learned to play the piano, and every new thing that comes along, she's 8. There's always this moment of when she goes, "It's too hard, I can't do it." And but I always remind her about the first time she said it, when it was the first page on the book, and she said, "I can't do this," and it was only playing 3 or 4 notes. And after practicing for 20 minutes one day and then a few more, blah blah blah, she got it and she'd nailed it, and now she's at the end of the book, basically saying the same thing. But she's nailed the last page, and she has a piano lesson this morning in school. So. But again, that all comes back to effort. It's all about the effort that we put in. And again, that's something that we want to try and model for pupils in schools, isn't it? That resilience and that effort. Without you can be the most talented person in the world, but without any sort of effort, we're not going to get there.
No, definitely not. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Andrew. You were brilliant.
No problem. It's been great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.